everyone. Welcome to On the Case with me, Detective Alex Cardinale. I hope you guys and gals are doing great, and I hope you're ready to learn about this week's crime case. This week, I'm going to talk about a crime that took place a couple of years ago, more like 10 years ago, but it's still a very popular crime case because it reminds us of the dangers of the internet. This week crime takes place from Stonewood, Louisiana. So this week's case takes place from Stonewood, Louisiana, and it involves a 12-year-old boy by the name of Justin Bloxom. Now, Justin thought he was meeting a 14-year-old girl for sex, but unfortunately, he met Danielle Horn, a 37-year-old taxi driver who murdered Justin. So we're going to find out about the murder of Justin Bloxom on today's edition of On the Case with Detective Alex Cardinale. So I'm going to tell you all about the crime and the murder. I'm going to share my thoughts on this crime as well at the end of the video. So, fellow detectives, post your thoughts on this crime in the comments below. I would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think of Justin Bloxom's murder? Let me know in the comments. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. Here is what to know about the crime. So, the victim is 12-year-old Justin Bloxom, and the criminal, the perpetrator, is 37-year-old Brian Horn. So let's learn about the victim first. 12-year-old Justin Bloxom. Here is a picture of Justin Bloxom. Now, as you can tell in this picture of Justin Bloxom, he looks like an energetic, excited, kind-hearted young man. And he was described as a friendly, outgoing young man. But unfortunately, Justin made a deadly mistake, which we're going to find out about. And here is a picture of Justin and his mother, who was devastated when she lost her son, obviously. Justin was loved by his mother. So let's learn about Justin Bloxom, who is unfortunately the victim of this crime. Justin was a 12-year-old boy from Louisiana who loved to text. He would text his friends, his family, and even strangers. Justin had 3 brothers. He was a skateboarder and he loved to play football. He would constantly be texting his friends, his family, and even strangers. He would send over 2,000 messages a month, and that is not an exaggeration. It is true. His mother would go on to talk about how he would send over 2,000 messages a month. And I learned about this case on ID Discovery's Web of Lies, and I got interested into it because this kind of crime happens a lot. Now, Justin's parents did not allow him on social media, but like most 12-year-olds do, they don't listen to their parents. And Justin created a MySpace account. And that was back in 2009, 2010, when MySpace was still popular and people would still use MySpace. And some of the stuff that Justin was putting on MySpace was kind of inappropriate. And unfortunately, I think one saying he put on MySpace is what attracted Mr. Daniel Horn, our perpetrator. So on his MySpace, Justin had wrote that he was a friendly neighborhood super pimp. and that is a word that is used to describe a bad person, but it can also lead to bad things. A pimp, as we all know, is a man who controls prostitutes and arranges clients for them, taking part of their earnings in return. So when Justin posted about being a neighborhood super pimp on MySpace, it was likely that Brian Horn saw that and took advantage of that, unfortunately. So Justin's mom found his MySpace account and took Justin off of MySpace. Unfortunately, his account was still up and people were still able to view it. His mother probably didn't know how to deactivate his account at the time. Now, Justin would sleep over his friend Dustin's house during the spring break, and he began communicating with what he thought was a 14-year-old girl while sleeping over his friend Dustin's house. Eventually, the communication led to Justin leaving the house at 3 a.m. in a taxi that was driven by Brian Horn. So that's everything to know about the victim, Justin Bloxom. Let's learn about the perpetrator, Brian Horn. And here is a picture of this perpetrator, Brian Horn, a very bad guy. He's a sex offender, and he's just an overall bad criminal. He looks like a douchebag in this picture, and that is because he is a douchebag. So let's learn about 37-year-old Brian Horn. Now, Brian was a sex offender who liked to get teenagers to have sex with his wife and other women, as he felt it would be good for the virgins and himself, as he thought they'd both be happy. Now, how sick is that? Basically, that's almost like child pornography, and it is child pornography. Getting young teenage virgins to have sex with his wife and other women just for his enjoyment is really disgusting. It's scum of the earth. Now, Brian Horn was a taxi cab driver, and he used his taxi to lure the victim, Justin. He posed as a 15-year-old girl to entice Bloxum via text to meet up with him for sex. Now, Brian Horn was texting with Justin all night long, and ultimately at 3 o'clock in the morning, Brian Horn picked up Justin and the crime went down. So now let's learn about the crime, which ultimately resulted in the murder and strangulation of 12-year-old Justin Bloxom. So Justin began texting the 15-year-old girl who was actually Brian Horn. The texting went on all night. Justin eventually agrees to meet and be picked up by a taxi. Neighbors report seeing the taxi cab. Justin gets picked up at around 3 a.m. that morning, that was driven by Brian Horn. Dustin wakes up the next morning to find Justin missing. Dustin goes to Justin's house and reports to them he is missing. A missing persons a missing persons report is filed. The girl made arrangements for a taxi to pick up Justin shortly after 3 a.m. And that is the girl that Justin had been texting. Justin Bloxom met the green action taxi cab driven by Brian Horn, and in less than 2 hours was dead. Authorities said messages detailing the plans and meeting were traced through phone records, giving DeSoto investigators the information they needed. The boys at the friend's house were watching movies. One of them last saw him sitting on the couch at around 3 a.m. texting on his phone. DeSoto Parish schools were getting out for spring break, and Justin and Dustin were having a sleepover. When the other students woke up later in the morning, Justin Bloxom was gone. He was first reported missing at around 10:30 a.m. Neighbors and friends began to search, and soon some came forward with information that a green action cab taxi was seen in the neighborhood that morning. A DeSoto patrol deputy stopped to check on a cab parking on the shoulder of US Highway 171 at around 6:30 a.m. in the morning. The driver, who was identified as Brian Horn through a driver's license check, told the deputy he lost his keys and was waiting for someone from the Bosser office to deliver them. Brian Horn was identified as a suspect after witnesses placed his green action taxi in the neighborhood where Justin Bloxum was visiting and later parked on the highway shoulder. Evidence gathered in the grassy area along the highway also linked Brian Horn to the crime. Keys to his taxi cab and a cell phone charger were located. Muddy boots seized and were a match to boot prints leading to where Bloxham's body was found. He had been strangled and semen was found around his anus. It was later figured out that Brian Horn's stepdaughter had Justin's phone number in her contacts in her phone that Brian Horn had access to, and Justin was using his phone to text the girl. Now, Brian Horn had a record of sexual charges. When he was 19, he was found with a 13-year-old child naked. So Brian Horn is just a disgusting, sick, twisted individual. So it is believed that Brian Horn picked up Justin and he was going to his house where Justin would have sex with Mr. Horn's wife and another woman. Justin had fought back and decided not to go through with the planned sexual acts. Brian Horn then strangled Justin, but detectives are not sure how Justin's semen got on his anus. Maybe he was he reached orgasm or something, but we can't figure it out. But anyways, Brian strangled Justin and placed him in the woods. Police saw Brian the next morning and his taxi on the side of a road, shaking his taxi cab angrily, like if something bad had happened to him or he did something that he regrets, and he was chain smoking cigarettes. Right away, this was a red flag to responding deputies in the area. Brian had told them he was waiting for help to come from the taxi company because he had lost his keys. Later in the day, a sergeant returned to the area, and that is where they made the gruesome discovery. A sergeant found Justin's body. Justin's cause of death was asphyxiation. Justin was murdered by Brian Horn. He had been strangled to death because he would not agree to the sexual acts that Brian Horn wanted Justin to do. So he murdered Justin. Brian Horn was sentenced to death for the kidnapping and the murder and strangulation of Justin Bloxom. Very, very sad crime, and a crime that happens a lot now because of technology. Technology can be a good thing, and for cases like this, technology can be your worst nightmare. So I'm going to share my thoughts on this case right now. So I think it was a sad case, definitely tragic for the Bloxom family. It's a horrific way to lose your young 12-year-old son. But when you have someone that is addicted to texting, you need to be aware of who your son is texting and why they're texting at 2, 3 a.m. in the morning. You should have set a limit for when he could not text anymore. But that's just my personal thought. It doesn't really matter at this point. What matters is that Brian Horn kidnapped, strangled, and murdered Justin Bloxom because Justin found out what Mr. Horn's real plans were, and that was for Justin to have sex with Brian's wife and another woman instead of a 15-year-old teenage woman. Really tragic, really sick, and horrific case. There are sick individuals out there, and Mr. Brian Horn is one of those sick, twisted, perverted individuals. And I am glad that Mr. Brian Horn, the asshole, the pervert, is getting death. He is getting the death sentence, and he definitely qualifies and deserves the death penalty for what he did. I can't imagine what Justin's mother, father, brothers, friends, and family went through to learn the way that he passed away and to learn that he was kidnapped and murdered, and he was texting who we thought was a 15-year-old girl, but it turned out to be a sex offender taxi cab driver. Very, very sad case, and I would like to offer my condolences to everyone that was affected by this crime in Stonewood, Louisiana. Very, very sad. And you know, a lot of people don't think of it, but my heart goes out to the sergeant that actually found the body of Justin Bloxom. You guys got to realize that these detectives that find the bodies are actually fathers themselves. So when they see a young boy deceased, they think of their own kids. So it hurts them psychologically as well. They get very emotional about it because they think of their kids. So overall, it's a very, very sad situation. I don't wish murder upon anybody. Anyone should never have to go through what the Bloxam family went through. So that leads to my message after this crime. And my message is simple: know who your kids are texting. Always be aware when your kids are texting somebody. Find out who they are texting. And if possible, read their text messages. It can save their lives and it can prevent the unpreventable, like kidnapping, like being lured, and like murder. So know who your kids are texting. Set a time limit. For example, your kid cannot text after 11 p.m. This will keep them safe and make sure they get a good night's sleep. But most importantly, it will make sure that there will never be another Brian Horn that will lure these kids out there for death, unfortunately. So know who your kids are texting. Be very secure online, especially at the young age of 12. And even older teenagers should be very aware of what the online world is like. The online world is very dangerous. There are a lot of criminals lurking online. There are pedophiles, there are human traffickers, there are drug dealers, there are serial killers, and there are murderers online. So to be safe, make sure you keep an eye on your kids on social media. All right, and that is this week's crime case. I know this was a rather quick show, but there really wasn't much to talk about on today's crime. But next week, we have an even worse crime to talk about because on next week's episode of On the Case, we are going to talk about Nestor de Jesus and his girlfriend, Paula. Now, I live in Florida, and at the time of this crime, I was living in Tampa Bay, Florida. So I remember this crime very well. So Nestor and his girlfriend Paula were struggling financially and they robbed a Bank of America, but police were right on their trail. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and unfortunately, in next week's crime, a beloved 19-year veteran police officer was shot and killed by Nestor de Jesus. So find out all about it. Find out how desperate times call for a murder of a cop featuring suspects Nestor de Jesus and his wife, Paula. Monday, May 16th, next Monday, 11 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Pacific. And crime lovers, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, the legendary Alex Cardinale, to find out about all the other crimes that I've talked about, including Tyler Barris, the infamous swatter who resulted in the death of an innocent man. I did that video on Wednesday last week because something came up last Monday night. That video has a small amount of views, but I think it deserves more. So check it out. All right, guys, stay safe. If you see a crime being committed, say something. See something, say something so you can stay safe. Have a great week, and I will see you on next week's episode of On the Case with Alex Cardinale. Thank you so much for watching, and stay safe, everybody. I'll see you next Monday. Ted Hood! Sergeant Alex Cardinale here, inviting you to be a part of the inaugural Memorial Day 2022 Bash, hosted by me, Sergeant Alex Cardinale. The inaugural Memorial Day Bash airs live Monday, May 30th, 2022 at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, right here on my YouTube channel, the legendary Alex Cardinale. The 2022 Memorial Day Bash is being hosted by me, Sergeant Alex Cardinale. And on the Memorial Day 2022 Bash, I will discuss the history of Memorial Day, and I will discuss why we celebrate Memorial Day. We're going to pay our respects to all the brave men and women out there fighting for us and this great country. USA! USA! Also on the inaugural Memorial Day Bash, I am going to address the veterans. Yes, that's right, Sergeant Alex Cardinale is going to address the veterans. We're also going to have a very special guest. That's right, we're going to have a very special guest. Former Army member James Anthony will be our very first guest for the first time ever on a holiday bash. That's going to be incredible. So we're going to speak to a former Army member as we pay our respects to the United States of America men and women who serve in our Army and in our military. There's also going to be an appearance by Chef Alex Cardinale, and Chef Alex is going to give you the best recipes to make for the veterans in your life. There'll also be an appearance by Aqua Alex, and Aqua Alex will talk about how fish tanks can help veterans. And if Chef Alex and Aqua Alex don't do the right thing, I'm going to have to put them in the camel clutch and the cobra clutch. Maggots! So the inaugural Memorial Day 2022 Bash goes down live Monday, May 30th, 2022, live 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, on my YouTube channel, the legendary Alex Cardinale. Come join me as we pay our respects to the United States military men and women, all those who serve, past or present. Don't be a maggot. Be there and be square, and let's pay respect to all the great military men and women. And that's an order. You're all dismissed.